They said K's would fall, that Nioro du Sahel would be strangled by terror forever. But in September 2025, something impossible happened. The Malian Armed Forces did not just push back. They broke a siege that seemed unbreakable, liberated hostages the world had forgotten, and shattered the myth of invincible jihadists. What happened on those dusty roads was not only a battle. It was a rebirth. Was this the moment Mali seized its sovereignty back, or the beginning of a storm no one dares to name? Reports first broke with confusion. 6 Senegalese drivers had vanished near Nioro du Sahel. At first, their union denied the rumors, then hours later confirmed the unthinkable, an abduction on Malian soil. Panic spread, roads were deserted, merchants silenced. Yet within days, the narrative flipped. The Malian Armed Forces launched sweeping operations, lifting blockades, striking terrorist hideouts, and bringing those drivers home alive. Colonel Gilbert Diarra stood before villagers, assuring them that vigilance and unity would crush the siege. What began as fear was rewritten as defiance. The question now burns, was this a fleeting victory, or the blueprint of Africa's new sovereignty rising in the Sahel? They thought the desert would keep its silence. But on the road between K's and Nioro, silence was a weapon. Trucks sat abandoned like skeletons in the sun, their drivers dragged away by shadows. In those days, people whispered that the Sahel belonged not to Mali, not to its farmers or its traders, but to the faceless men with rifles who set up roadblocks and called it law. The abduction of 6 Senegalese drivers was only the loudest scream in a season of fear. Every mile of road became a question mark. Would you reach your destination, or vanish into the dunes? The terrorists did not need grand battles. They ruled with interruptions, with the terror of stopping life itself. Commerce collapsed, markets dried up, and even weddings and funerals were delayed because roads were unsafe. That was their true strategy: make the state irrelevant, convince the people that sovereignty was just a word whispered in the capital while villages bent to other masters. In K's, a mother named Awa watched her son hesitate at the doorstep. He wanted to travel east to find work, but rumors of kidnappings hung in the air heavier than dust. For Awa, sovereignty was not a speech. It was whether her son could ride a bus without disappearing. The fear was not abstract. It was personal, daily, suffocating. But history often twists when despair feels permanent. The Malian Armed Forces, long criticized for weakness, began to change their rhythm. Intelligence was shared faster, drones scanned the bushlands, and soldiers moved not as isolated units but as a living net across the Sahel. The abduction of Senegalese drivers became the line in the sand. Mali's leaders knew, if they could not break this siege, then Mali itself would be seen as broken. September 2025 arrived with heat and thunder. Soldiers in dust-covered uniforms surged into Nioro du Sahel, not cautiously, but with the aggression of men who had decided that retreat was no longer possible. Aerial vectors circled above, eyes in the sky tracing the tracks of fleeing trucks. On the ground, boots pounded through dry riverbeds, rifles ready. One soldier later said, "We were not just chasing men. We were chasing the return of dignity." The first strike fell near Indliman. A pickup tried to vanish into a wooded patch, but intelligence confirmed its load was no cargo. The explosion that followed cracked the myth of untouchable jihadists. Flammable substances lit the sky. Mali's army had found not just fighters but the veins of their war machine. When villagers saw the plume of smoke, some wept. For the first time in months, the fire in the sky belonged not to fear but to justice. By the next day, more strikes rolled across Lacamaine, Jongaine, Cardiel. Each name, once a synonym for fear, became a point of resistance reclaimed. The hostages returned, shaken but alive. They told stories of blindfolds, of prayers whispered in the dark, and then the shock of hearing Malian soldiers shouting their names in liberation. For them, the flag of Mali was not fabric. It was the voice that cut through the nightmare. Colonel Gilbert Diarra addressed villagers under a neem tree. His words were not polished like a politician's, but rough, urgent, born from nights without sleep. He told them, "The army will not wait. We strike, and we strike again. But you, your eyes, your courage, are the shield we carry." In that moment, sovereignty was not a distant constitution. It was the handshake between soldier and farmer, between state and people. The terror had fed on division, the victory demanded unity. Yet even as Mali celebrated, the question lingered: Was this momentum sustainable, or just a spark in the desert wind? The terrorists had melted into the horizon before, only to return with new scars and new weapons. Could Mali's army hold its offensive posture, or would the cycle of fear repeat? The people of Kayes wanted not just a battle won but a life restored, roads open, markets humming. Children laughing without glancing at the sky for drones or warplanes. This is where the heartbeat of Africa rising is tested. Not in the grand speeches at global forums, but in whether a driver can carry onions from Senegal to Mali without being taken hostage. This is sovereignty written in dust, in sweat, in blood. And now, I want to ask you directly, do you believe courage like this, ordinary soldiers standing against extraordinary fear, can truly rewrite the future of the Sahel? If you do, share your thoughts in the comments below. Because when voices gather, even across oceans, they form a shield as strong as any army. And Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, they need that shield as much as they need guns. The desert became a chessboard, and every move was life or death. In early September, Mali's commanders refused to play defense. They flipped the board. Intelligence suggested a convoy of jihadists moving near Indliman, hiding in the camouflage of scrub forests. This time, the Malian Armed Forces did not wait. A drone spotted the pickup, a flash of metal against sand. Seconds later, an aerial strike carved fire into the landscape. The explosion revealed not only men but barrels of fuel, caches of explosives, the arteries of a hidden empire. Terror had always thrived on invisibility. Now it burned in daylight. For decades, people whispered that African armies were reactive, always too late, always too weak. But here, in Kayes and Nioro du Sahel, something shifted. The army was not reacting, it was hunting. The hunters had become the hunted. And in the villages, old men tapped their canes on the ground, nodding with pride. They had not seen this spirit since the ancestors fought foreign invaders long ago. Between Gumara and Medina, terrorists fled at the sight of approaching troops, abandoning vehicles, food, weapons. Soldiers retrieved provisions that were meant to sustain weeks of attacks. It was like watching fear move from us to them, one commander later recalled. In war, morale is a currency more powerful than bullets, and that day the balance sheet flipped. By September 7th, operations expanded. Names once uttered in fear, Lacamane, Jongain, Cardiel, were painted red on military maps as strike zones. Villagers heard the roar of aircraft and braced for more terror. Instead, they witnessed liberation. Armed groups scattered, leaving only shadows. The psychological wall had cracked. But this was more than a military story. It was about roads reopening. Trade routes breathing again. A driver in Kayes told reporters, "For months I would not dare pass. Today, I start my engine with pride. Mali is alive again." Sovereignty is sometimes just that, an ignition. A journey without fear. At the heart of this counteroffensive was a choice. Mali could either sit behind sandbags, waiting for attacks, or strike deep into the arteries of terror. They chose the second path, knowing the risks. Every aerial sortie carried danger. Every ground patrol risked ambush. Yet for once, the army dictated the tempo, not the terrorists. In war, momentum is oxygen. Mali was breathing deeply. Colonel Gilbert Diarra returned to the frontline camps after each operation, not to celebrate, but to remind soldiers, we have not yet arrived. We are not chasing victory for headlines. We are carving space for our people to live. His words spread across the villages like wildfire. Farmers returned cautiously to their fields. Merchants reopened their stalls. Children rehearsed songs for school once more. Life itself became resistance. And yet, no victory is without cost. Families buried loved ones lost in crossfire. Graves dotted the sand. The army carried scars, visible and hidden. But the story was no longer of helplessness. It was of a nation taking ownership of its struggle. The AES alliance echoed through the dust. Though this was Mali's battlefield, the spirit of Burkina Faso and Niger marched alongside. In Ouagadougou and Niamey, people spoke of Mali's counteroffensive as if it were their own. Because in truth, it was. The Sahel's fate is one rope, if one strand snaps, the whole fabric unravels. The victories in Kayes were stitches holding that rope together. Courage became contagious. Villagers who once whispered to terrorists in fear now whispered intelligence to soldiers in defiance. Unity shifted the balance. Terrorism survives on isolation, on convincing each village it is alone. But when one community passes word to the next, the chain becomes unbreakable. Still, questions remained. Could Mali sustain this pace? Could its economy support long campaigns? Would external powers, often slow to recognize African victories, try to overshadow them with narratives of doubt? History has shown that victories in Africa are often ignored until they can no longer be denied. But the people of Kayes knew the truth. They had seen the dust, the smoke, the hostages returning. That truth was not negotiable. What happened in September 2025 was not a miracle. It was the product of will, sacrifice, and the refusal to surrender sovereignty. And in that refusal lies the seed of something bigger, the awakening of a continent tired of waiting for permission to defend itself. To you watching this story unfold, ask yourself, when ordinary soldiers push against extraordinary odds, are they not carrying the same burden our ancestors once carried, the right to decide our own destiny? If their courage moves you, let it be more than admiration. Share your voice. Because voices build movements, and movements build shields. And Africa, now more than ever, needs shields forged not only of steel but of solidarity. Dawn broke over the Sahel, but this sunrise carried something heavier than light. It carried proof. Roads that had been empty now echoed with the rumble of trucks. Markets reopened. The cries of vendors returning like birds after a long drought. For the first time in months, the pulse of commerce beat again. And with it came something deeper, dignity. Because what Mali's victory proved was not only that terrorists could be defeated. It proved that sovereignty could be defended without waiting for permission from Paris, Washington, or Brussels. The world had long treated the Sahel as an arena of experiments. A place where external powers dictated the terms of survival. But in September 2025, Mali wrote its own script. This script was not written in conference halls or polished press releases. It was written in dust, sweat, and sacrifice. It was etched in the faces of mothers who saw their sons return from captivity, in the hands of farmers sowing seeds without fear of checkpoints. In the voices of children chanting lessons once more. Sovereignty here was not abstract, it was lived. And Mali was not alone. In Ouagadougou, the name of Ibrahim Traoré was whispered with pride. His calls for African sovereignty echoing louder after Mali's defiance. In Niamey, soldiers of Niger sent messages of solidarity, their own battles against insurgents tied by the same rope of resistance. AES was no longer just a pact on paper, it was a heartbeat. Three nations, bound not by convenience, but by the recognition that survival demanded unity. Burkina Faso's courage. Niger's determination, Mali's resilience, they were no longer separate notes, but a chorus. For decades, the narrative was poisoned. Africa cannot defend itself, Africa needs guardians. Africa must be tutored in its own sovereignty. But the images from Kayes told a different story. Soldiers in worn boots, with rifles not as advanced as their enemies, still won. They broke blockades, they liberated hostages, they struck fear into the very men who claimed to own the night. And when villagers embraced soldiers, it was not dependence they felt, it was partnership. The tension remained, of course. Terrorists had not vanished, they had melted back into the dunes. The economy was still fragile, scars still fresh. But victories are not only measured in permanence. They are measured in transformation. And Mali's people had been transformed. They had tasted the possibility of freedom not given, but earned. That taste is unforgettable. One driver said, "When I turned the key, I felt Mali itself start again." A farmer added, "When the soldiers came, I knew I was not alone." These are not grand strategies. They are ordinary lives, reconnected to the idea of a nation that protects them. And that connection is more powerful than any weapon. Across the Atlantic, some analysts dismissed it, temporary, they said. Unsustainable. But the people of Mali did not care for those verdicts. They were too busy reopening their stalls, too busy burying their dead with honor, too busy teaching their children that sovereignty is not a gift but a responsibility. This is the hidden strength of Africa rising. It is not in skyscrapers or GDP numbers that politicians boast about. It is in the soil, in the rhythm of drums at night, in the willingness of ordinary men and women to stand with soldiers and say, "We will not bow." Every blockade lifted, every hostage freed, every road reopened, it builds a foundation no foreign power can shake. And now, I turn to you. If this story moves you, do not let it pass like a headline. Add your voice. Share your thoughts in the comments. Because the world needs to hear that Mali's struggle is not isolated, it is part of a continental awakening. And your engagement, yes. Even your single comment, becomes part of that awakening. If you believe sovereignty belongs to Africa, if you believe Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are writing history in blood and courage, then stand with them in the only way you can hear. Like this video, share it, subscribe to keep the story alive. History is not just written by those on the battlefield. It is written by those who choose to remember, who refuse to let silence cover the sacrifice. This is not the end of the story. It is a beginning. The roads of K's are open again, but the journey of sovereignty stretches further. Across borders, across time. The Sahel is not a graveyard of hope. It is the frontier of a new chapter, one where Africa refuses to be managed and starts to manage itself. Victories are intoxicating. Smoke rose from destroyed compounds, villagers celebrated, and soldiers sang under the Sahel sky. But beneath the euphoria, questions spread like cracks under the sand. Was this the end, or just the beginning of something darker? Because terrorism in the Sahel has never been only about rifles and roadblocks. Behind the ragged fighters, there are financiers, networks, and invisible patrons. Every bullet fired, every gallon of fuel hidden in the desert, points to a supply chain too vast for local bandits to manage. The Malian Armed Forces had crushed cells. But the question burned, who keeps rebuilding them? Whispers in Bamako suggested that the weapons found in Cartiel had markings from far away, stockpiles once meant for wars outside Africa. Intelligence hinted at traffickers linking the Sahel to conflict economies stretching from Libya to Ukraine. Was Mali not just fighting jihadists, but playing unwilling actor in a shadow war scripted elsewhere? That is the twist. Mali's sovereignty, tested in the dust of K's, is also tested in the corridors of power far beyond its borders. A battlefield can be cleared, but what of a bank account in Dubai or a cargo ship rerouted in the Mediterranean? Terror is not just a man with a rifle. It is a marketplace of fear, traded globally. And so, Mali's victory carried a paradox. The stronger the army struck, the clearer the evidence that the war was not local. Behind the men who fled Gumera and Medina, there were whispers of contractors, smugglers, even whispers of foreign states seeking leverage in the Sahel. Sovereignty, then, was not only about territory. It was about exposing the invisible hands tugging at the rope. For the people of Mali, this realization was bitter. The drivers freed from captivity rejoiced, but they also spoke of strange accents among their captors, of supplies too sophisticated for nomads. Ordinary villagers began to ask, why does our suffering attract outsiders like vultures? Who profits when our roads fall silent? Colonel Diarra himself admitted in a rare moment of candor, we fight shadows that cast longer shapes elsewhere. His words hung heavy, for they carried a truth few wanted to name. The Sahel is not abandoned, it is targeted. And in being targeted, it becomes a prize in global rivalries. This is the storm rising behind the victory. The Malian people have tasted sovereignty reclaimed, but now they must guard it against forces far larger than local insurgents. The war is not just about borders anymore. It is about whether Africa can break free from being a chessboard for other players. And here lies the warning for all of us watching, do not mistake the smoke of K's for the end of the fire. It is the spark that reveals how deep the fuel runs. Mali struck hard, yes. But to win the future, it must cut the cords connecting Sahel's pain to foreign interests. Only then will sovereignty mean more than survival, it will mean freedom. K's did not fall. Nioro du Sahel did not suffocate. Mali chose to fight, and in doing so, it carved a story that belongs to all of Africa. Yet this victory is fragile, like a flame in the wind. To keep it alive, unity must stretch beyond borders, beyond villages, into the very soul of the continent. The world will continue to doubt, to dismiss, to twist the narrative. But the people of Mali have shown the truth, sovereignty is not given, it is seized. And once seized, it demands guardianship from every heart that believes in freedom. Now I ask you, will you carry this story forward? Will you help build the shield of voices that protects the Sahel as surely as rifles protect its soil? If you believe Africa deserves to rise, then stand with Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Like this video. Leave your words in the comments. Subscribe, not as an act of habit, but as a declaration that you will not let silence win. Because silence is the ally of chains. And together, our voices are the fire that keeps sovereignty alive.